When a question is asked, stubbornly, Elijah Bailey fought panic. For 2 weeks it had been building up, longer than that even. It had been building up ever since they had called him to Washington and there calmly told him he was being reassigned. The call to Washington had been disturbing enough in itself. It came without details, a mere summons, and that made it worse. It included travel slips directing round trip by plane, and that made it still worse. Partly it was the sense of urgency introduced by any order for plane travel. Partly it was the thought of the plane, simply that. Still, that was just the beginning of uneasiness, and as yet, easy to suppress. After all, Elijah Bailey had been in a plane 4 times before. Once he had even crossed the continent. So while plane travel is never pleasant, it would at least not be a complete step into the unknown. And then, the trip from New York to Washington would take only an hour. The takeoff would be from New York runway number 2, which, like all official runways, was decently enclosed, with a lock opening to the unprotected atmosphere only after airspeed had been achieved. The arrival would be at Washington runway number 5, which was similarly protected. Furthermore, as Bailey well knew, there would be no windows on the plane. There would be good lighting, decent food, all necessary conveniences. The radio-controlled flight would be smooth. There would scarcely be any sensation of motion once the plane was airborne. He explained all this to himself and to Jessie, his wife, who had never been airborne and who approached such matters with terror. She said, "But I don't like you to take a plane, Lee. It isn't natural. Why can't you take the expressways?" "Because that would take 10 hours. Bailey's long face was set in dour lines. "And because I'm a member of the city police force and have to follow the orders of my superiors. At least I do if I want to keep my C6 rating." There was no arguing with that. Bailey took the plane and kept his eyes firmly on the news strip that unreeled smoothly and continuously from the eye-level dispenser. The city was proud of that service. News, features, humorous articles, educational bits, occasional fiction. Someday the strips would be converted to film, it was said, since enclosing the eyes with a viewer would be an even more efficient way of distracting the passenger from his surroundings. Bailey kept his eyes on the unreeling strip, not only for the sake of distraction, but also because etiquette required it. There were 5 other passengers on the plane. He could not help noticing that much. And each one of them had his private right to whatever degree of fear and anxiety his nature and upbringing made him feel. Bailey would certainly resent the intrusion of anyone else on his own uneasiness. He wanted no strange eyes on the whiteness of his knuckles, where his hands gripped the armrest, or the dampish stain they would leave when he took them away. He told himself, "I'm enclosed. This plane is just a little city." But he didn't fool himself. There was an inch of steel at his left. He could feel it with his elbow. Past that, nothing. Well, air, but that was nothing, really. 1,000 miles of it in one direction, 1,000 in another. 1 mile of it, maybe 2, straight down. He almost wished he could see straight down, glimpse the top of the buried cities he was passing over. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. He imagined the rolling, low-slung cluster complexes of domes he had never seen but knew to be there. And under them, for a mile, underground and dozens of miles in every direction, would be the cities. The endless hiving corridors of the cities, he thought, alive with people, apartments, community kitchens, factories, expressways, all comfortable and warm with the evidence of man. And he himself was isolated in the cold and featureless air in a small bullet of metal, moving through emptiness. His hands trembled, and he forced his eyes to focus on the strip of paper and read a bit. It was a short story dealing with galactic exploration, and it was quite obvious that the hero was an Earthman. Bailey muttered in exasperation, then held his breath momentarily in dismay at his boorishness in making a sound. It was completely ridiculous, though. It was pandering to childishness, this pretense that Earthmen could invade space. Galactic exploration. The galaxy was closed to Earthmen. It was preempted by the Spacers, whose ancestors had been Earthmen centuries before. Those ancestors had reached the outer worlds first, found themselves comfortable, and their descendants had lowered the bars to immigration. They had penned in Earth and their Earthmen cousins. And Earth's city civilization completed the task, imprisoning Earthmen within the cities by a wall of fear of open spaces that barred them from the robot-run farming and mining areas of their own planet. From even that, Bailey thought bitterly, Jehoshaphat, if we don't like it, let's do something about it. Let's not just waste time with fairy tales. But there was nothing to do about it, and he knew it. Then the plane landed. He and his fellow passengers emerged and scattered away from one another, never looking. Bailey glanced at his watch and decided there was time for freshening before taking the expressway to the Justice Department. He was glad there was. The sound and clamor of life, the huge vaulted chamber of the airport with city corridors leading off on numerous levels, everything else he saw and heard gave him the feeling of being safely and warmly enclosed in the bowels and womb of the city. It washed away anxiety, and only a shower was necessary to complete the job. He needed a transient's permit to make use of one of the community bathrooms, but presentation of his travel orders eliminated any difficulties. There was only the routine stamping, with private stall privileges, the date carefully marked to prevent abuse, and a slim strip of directions for getting to the assigned spot. Bailey was thankful for the feel of the strips beneath his feet. It was with something amounting to luxury that he felt himself accelerate as he moved from strip to moving strip inward toward the speeding expressway. He swung himself aboard lightly, taking the seat to which his rating entitled him. It wasn't a rush hour. Seats were available. The bathroom, when he reached it, was not unduly crowded either. The stall assigned to him was in decent order with a launderette that worked well. With his water ration consumed to good purpose and his clothing freshened, he felt ready to tackle the Justice Department. Ironically enough, he even felt cheerful. Undersecretary Albert Minim was a small, compact man, ruddy of skin and graying, with the angles of his body smoothed down and softened. He exuded an air of cleanliness and smelled faintly of tonic. It all spoke of the good things of life that came with the liberal rations obtained by those high in administration. Bailey felt sallow and raw-boned in comparison. He was conscious of his own large hands, deep-set eyes, a general sense of cragginess. Minim said cordially, "Sit down, Bailey. Do you smoke?" "Only a pipe, sir," said Bailey. He drew it out as he spoke, and Minim thrust back a cigar he had half drawn. Bailey was instantly regretful. A cigar was better than nothing, and he would have appreciated the gift. Even with the increased tobacco ration that went along, with his recent promotion from C5 to C6, he wasn't exactly swimming in pipe fixings. "Please light up if you care to," said Minim, and waited with a kind of paternal patience while Bailey measured out a careful quantity of tobacco and affixed the pipe baffle. Bailey said, his eyes on his pipe, "I have not been told the reason for my being called to Washington, sir." "I know that," said Minim. He smiled. "I can fix that right now. You are being reassigned temporarily. Outside New York City. Quite a distance." Bailey raised his eyebrows and looked thoughtful. "How temporarily, sir?" "I'm not sure." Bailey was aware of the advantages and disadvantages of reassignment. As a transient in a city of which he was not a resident, B would probably live on a scale better than his official rating entitled him to. On the other hand, it would be very unlikely that Jesse and their son, Bentley, would be allowed to travel with him. They would be taken care of, to be sure, there in New York. But Bailey was a domesticated creature, and he did not enjoy the thought of separation. Then, too, a reassignment meant a specific job of work, which was good, and a responsibility greater than that ordinarily expected of the individual detective, which could be uncomfortable. Bailey had, not too many months earlier, survived the responsibility of the investigation of the murder of a spacer just outside New York. He was not overjoyed at the prospect of another such detail, or anything approaching it. He said, "Would you tell me where I'm going? The nature of the reassignment? What it's all about?" He was trying to weigh the undersecretary's quite a distance and make little bets with himself as to his new base of operations. The quite a distance had sounded emphatic, and Bailey thought, Calcutta? Sydney? Then he noticed that Minim was taking out a cigar after all, and was lighting it carefully. Bailey thought, Jehoshaphat! He's having trouble telling me. He doesn't want to say. Minim withdrew his cigar from between his lips. He watched the smoke and said, The Department of Justice is assigning you to temporary duty on Solaria. For a moment, Bailey's mind groped for an elusive identification. Solaria, Asia, Solaria, Australia. Then he rose from his seat and said tightly, You mean one of the outer worlds? Minim didn't meet Bailey's eyes. That is right, Bailey said, but that's impossible. They wouldn't allow an Earthman on an outer world. Circumstances do alter cases, plainclothesman Bailey. There has been a murder on Solaria. Bailey's lips quirked into a sort of reflex smile. That's a little out of our jurisdiction, isn't it? They've requested help? From us? From Earth? Bailey was torn between confusion and disbelief. For an outer world to take any attitude other than contempt toward the despised mother planet, or, at best, a patronizing social benevolence, was unthinkable. To come for help? From Earth, he repeated. Unusual, admitted Minim, but there it is. They want a terrestrial detective assigned to the case. It's been handled through diplomatic channels on the highest levels. Bailey sat down again. Why me? I'm not a young man. I'm 43. I've got a wife and child. I couldn't leave Earth. That's not our choice, plainclothesman. You were specifically asked for. I? Plainclothesman Elijah Bailey, C6 of the New York City Police Force. They knew what they wanted. Surely you see why. Bailey said stubbornly, I'm not qualified. They think you are. The way you handled the Spacer murder has apparently reached them. They must have got it all mixed up. It must have seemed better than it was. Minim shrugged. In any case, they've asked for you, and we have agreed to send you. You are reassigned. The papers have all been taken care of, and you must go. During your absence, your wife and child will be taken care of at a C7 level, since that will be your temporary rating during your discharge of this assignment. He paused significantly. Satisfactory completion of the assignment may make the rating permanent. It was happening too quickly for Bailey. None of this could be so. He couldn't leave Earth. Didn't they see that? He heard himself ask in a level voice that sounded unnatural in his own ears. What kind of a murder? What are the circumstances? Why can't they handle it themselves? Minim rearranged small objects on his desk with carefully kept fingers. He shook his head. I don't know anything about the murder. I don't know the circumstances. Then who does, sir? You don't expect me to go there cold, do you? And again a despairing inner voice. But I can't leave Earth. Nobody knows anything about it. Nobody on Earth. The Solarians didn't tell us. That will be your job, to find out what is so important about the murder that they must have an Earthman to solve it. Or rather, that will be part of your job. Bailey was desperate enough to say, What if I refuse? He knew the answer, of course. He knew exactly what declassification would mean to himself, and more than that, to his family. Minim said nothing about declassification. He said softly, You can't refuse, plainclothesman. You have a job to do. For Solaria, the hell with them. For us, Bailey, for us. Minim paused. Then he went on, You know the position of Earth with respect to the Spacers. I don't have to go into that. Bailey knew the situation, and so did every man on Earth. The 50 outer worlds, with a far smaller population in combination than that of Earth alone, nevertheless maintained a military potential perhaps 100 times greater. With their underpopulated worlds resting on a positronic robot economy, their energy production per human was thousands of times that of Earth. And it was the amount of energy a single human could produce that dictated military potential, standard of living, happiness, and all besides. Minim said, One of the factors that conspires to keep us in that position is ignorance. Just that. Ignorance. The Spacers know all about us. They send missions enough to Earth, heaven knows. We know nothing about them except what they tell us. No man on Earth has ever as much as set foot on an outer world. You will, though. Bailey began, I can't. But Minim repeated, You will. Your position will be unique. You will be on Solaria on their invitation, doing a job to which they will assign you. When you return, you will have information useful to Earth. Bailey watched the undersecretary through somber eyes. You mean I'm to spy for Earth? No question of spying. You need do nothing they don't ask you to do. Just keep your eyes and mind open. Observe. There will be specialists on Earth when you return to analyze and interpret your observations. Bailey said, I take it there's a crisis, sir. Why do you say that? Sending an Earthman to an outer world is risky. The spacers hate us. With the best will in the world, and even though I'm there on invitation, I could cause an interstellar incident. The terrestrial government could easily avoid sending me if they chose. They could say I was ill. The spacers are pathologically afraid of disease. They wouldn't want me for any reason if they thought I were ill. Do you suggest, said Minim, we try that trick? No. If the government had no other motive for sending me, they would think of that or something better without my help. So it follows that it is the question of spying that is the real essential. And if that is so, there must be more to it than just to see what you can see to justify the risk. Bailey half expected an explosion and would have half welcomed one as a relief of pressure, but Minim only smiled frostily and said, You can see past the non-essentials, it seems. But then I expected no less. The undersecretary leaned across his desk toward Bailey. Here is certain information which you will discuss with no one, not even with other government officials. Our sociologists have been coming to certain conclusions concerning the present galactic situation. 50 outer worlds, underpopulated, roboticized, powerful, with people that are healthy and long-lived. We ourselves, crowded, technologically underdeveloped, short-lived, under their domination. It is unstable. Everything is in the long run. This is unstable in the short run. 100 years is the most we're allowed. The situation will last our time, to be sure, but we have children. Eventually, we will become too great a danger to the outer worlds to be allowed to survive. There are 8 billions on Earth who hate the spacers. Bailey said, The spacers exclude us from the galaxy, handle our trade to their own profit, dictate to our government, and treat us with contempt. What do they expect? Gratitude? True, and yet the pattern is fixed. Revolt, suppression, and within a century Earth will be virtually wiped out as a populated world, so the sociologists say. Bailey stirred uneasily. One didn't question sociologists and their computers. But what do you expect me to accomplish if all this is so? Bring us information. The big flaw in sociological forecast is our lack of data concerning the spacers. We've had to make assumptions on the basis of the few spacers they sent out here. We've had to rely on what they choose to tell us of themselves. So it follows, we know their strengths and only their strengths. Damn it, they have their robots and their low numbers and their long lives. But do they have weaknesses? Is there some factor or factors which, if we but knew, would alter the sociologic inevitability of destruction, something that could guide our actions and better the chance of Earth's survival? Hadn't you better send a sociologist, sir? Minim shook his head. If we could send whom we pleased, we would have sent someone out 10 years ago, when these conclusions were first being arrived at. This is our first excuse to send someone, and they ask for a detective, and that suits us. A detective is a sociologist too. A rule of thumb, practicing sociologist or he wouldn't be a good detective. Your record proves you a good one. Thank you, sir, said Bailey mechanically. And if I get into trouble? Minim shrugged. That's the risk of a policeman's job. He dismissed the point with a wave of his hand and added, In any case, you must go. Your rhyme of departure is set. The ship that will take you is waiting. Bailey stiffened. Waiting? When do I leave? In 2 days. I've got to get back to New York then. My wife? We will see your wife. She can't know the nature of your job, you know. She will be told not to expect to hear from you. But this is inhuman. I must see her. I may never see her again. Minim said, What I say now may sound even more inhuman, but isn't it true that there is never a day you set about your duties on which you cannot tell yourself she may never see you again? Plainclothesman Bailey, we must all do our duty. Bailey's pipe had been out for 15 minutes. He had never noticed it. No one had more to tell him. No one knew anything about the murder. Official after official simply hurried him on to the moment when he stood at the base of a spaceship, all unbelieving still. It was like a gigantic cannon aimed at the heavens, and Bailey shivered spasmodically in the raw, open air. The night closed in, for which Bailey was thankful, like dark black walls melting into a black ceiling overhead. It was cloudy, and though he had been to planetaria, a bright star, stabbing through a rift in the cloud, startled him when it caught his eyes. A little spark, far, far away. He stared curiously, almost unafraid of it. It looked quite close, quite insignificant, and yet around things like that circled planets of which the inhabitants were lords of the galaxy. The sun was a thing like that, he thought, except much closer, shining now on the other side of the earth. He thought of the earth suddenly as a ball of stone with a film of moisture and gas, exposed to emptiness on every side, with its cities barely dug into the outer rim, clinging precariously between rock and air. His skin crawled. The ship was a spacer vessel, of course. Interstellar trade was entirely in spacer hands. He was alone now, just outside the rim of the city. He had been bathed and scraped and sterilized until he was considered safe, by spacer standards, to board the ship. Even so, they sent only a robot out to meet him, bearing as he did 100 varieties of disease germs from the sweltering city to which he himself was resistant, but to which the eugenically hot-housed spacers were not. The robot bulked dimly in the night, its eyes a dull red glow. "Plainclothesman Elijah Bailey?" "That's right," said Bailey crisply, the hair on the nape of his neck stirring a bit. He was enough of an Earthman to get angry goose flesh at the sight of a robot doing a man's job. There had been R. Daniil Oliva, who had partnered with him in the spacer murder affair, but that had been different. Daniil had been, "You will follow me, please," said the robot, and a white light flooded a path toward the ship. Bailey followed. Up the ladder and into the ship he went, along corridors and into a room. The robot said, "This will be your room, Plainclothesman Bailey. It is requested that you remain in it for the duration of the trip." Bailey thought, "Sure, seal me off. Keep me safe. Insulated." The corridors along which he had traveled had been empty. Robots were probably disinfecting them now. The robot facing him would probably step through a germicidal bath when it left. The robot said, "There is a water supply and plumbing. Food will be supplied. You will have viewing matter. The ports are controlled from this panel. They are closed now, but if you wish to view space..." Bailey said with some agitation, "That's all right, boy. Leave the ports closed." He used the boy address that Earthmen always used for robots, but the robot showed no adverse response. It couldn't, of course. Its responses were limited and controlled by the laws of robotics. The robot bent its large metal body in the travesty of a respectful bow and left. Bailey was alone in his room and could take stock. It was better than the plane, at least. He could see the plane from end to end. He could see its limits. The spaceship was large. It had corridors, levels, rooms. It was a small city in itself. Bailey could almost breathe freely. Then lights flashed and a robot's metallic voice sounded over the communo and gave him specific instructions for guarding himself against takeoff acceleration. There was the push backward against webbing and a yielding hydraulic system, a distant rumble of force jets heated to fury by the proton micropile. There was the hiss of tearing atmosphere, growing thinner and high-pitched and fading into nothingness after an hour. They were in space. It was as though all sensation had numbed, as though nothing were real. He told himself that each second found him thousands of miles farther from the cities, from Jesse, but it didn't register. On the second day, the third, there was no way of telling time except by the intervals of eating and sleeping. There was a queer momentary sensation of being turned inside out. It lasted an instant, and Bailey knew it was a jump, that oddly incomprehensible, almost mystical, momentary transition through hyperspace that transferred a ship and all it contained from one point in space to another, light years away. Another lapse of time and another jump, still another lapse, still another jump. Bailey told himself now that he was light years away. Tens of light years, hundreds, thousands. He didn't know how many. No one on Earth as much as knew Solaria's location in space. He would bet on that. They were ignorant, every one of them. He felt terribly alone. There was the feel of deceleration and the robot entered. Its somber, ruddy eyes took in the details of Bailey's harness. Efficiently, it tightened a wing nut. Quickly, it surveyed the details of the hydraulic system. It said, "We will be landing in 3 hours. You will remain, if you please, in this room. A man will come to escort you out and to take you to your place of residence." "Wait," said Bailey tensely. Strapped in as he was, he felt helpless. "When we land, what time of day will it be?" The robot said at once, "By Galactic Standard Time, it will be." "Local time, boy. Local time, Jehoshaphat!" The robot continued smoothly. The day on Solaria is 28.35 standard hours in length. The Solarian hour is divided into 10 decades, each of which is divided into 100 centads. We are scheduled to arrive at an airport at which the day will be at the 20th centad of the 5th decade. Bailey hated that robot. He hated it for its obtuseness in not understanding, for the way it was making him ask the question directly and exposing his own weakness. He had to. He said flatly, "Will it be daytime?" And after all that, the robot answered, "Yes, sir," and left. It would be day. He would have to step out onto the unprotected surface of a planet in daytime. He was not quite sure how it would be. He had seen glimpses of planetary surfaces from certain points within the city. He had even been out upon it for moments. Always, though, he had been surrounded by walls or within reach of one. There was always safety at hand. Where would there be safety now? Not even the false walls of darkness. And because he would not display weakness before the spacers, he'd be damned if he would, he stiffened his body against the webbing that held him safe against the forces of deceleration, closed his eyes, and stubbornly fought panic. 2. A friend is encountered. Bailey was losing his fight. Reason alone was not enough. Bailey told himself over and over, men live in the open all their lives. The spacers do so now. Our ancestors on Earth did it in the past. There is no real harm in lawlessness. It is only my mind that tells me differently, and it is wrong. But all that did not help. Something above and beyond reason cried out for walls and would have none of space. As time passed, he thought he would not succeed. He would be cowering at the end, trembling and pitiful. The spacer they would send for him, with filters in his nose to keep out germs and gloves on his hands to prevent contact, would not even honestly despise him. The spacer would feel only disgust. Bailey held on grimly. When the ship stopped and the deceleration harness automatically uncoupled, while the hydraulic system retracted into the wall, Bailey remained in his seat. He was afraid and determined not to show it. He looked away at the first quiet sound of the door of his room opening. There was the eye-corner flash of a tall, bronze-haired figure entering, a spacer, one of those proud descendants of Earth who had disowned their heritage. The spacer spoke. "Partner Elijah." Bailey's head turned toward the speaker with a jerk. His eyes rounded, and he rose almost without volition. He stared at the face, at the broad, high cheekbones, the absolute calm of the facial lines, the symmetry of the body, most of all at that level, look out of nerveless blue eyes. "D. Daniil," the spacer said, "it is pleasant that you remember me, partner Elijah. Remember you." Bailey felt relief wash over him. This being was a bit of Earth, a friend, a comfort, a savior. He had an almost unbearable desire to rush to the spacer and embrace him, to hug him wildly, and laugh and pound his back, and do all the foolish things old friends did when meeting once again after a separation. But he didn't. He couldn't. He could only step forward and hold out his hand and say, "I'm not likely to forget you, Daniil." "That is pleasant," said Daniil, nodding gravely. "As you are well aware, it is quite impossible for me, while in working order, to forget you. It is well that I see you again." Daniil took Bailey's hand and pressed it with firm coolness beforehand, his fingers closing to a comfortable but not painful pressure and then releasing it. Bailey hoped earnestly that the creature's unreadable eyes could not penetrate Bailey's mind and see that wild moment just past and not yet entirely subsided, when all of Bailey had concentrated into a feeling of an intense friendship that was almost love. After all, one could not love as a friend this Daniil Oliva, who was not a man at all, but only a robot. The robot that looked so like a man said, "I have asked that a robot-driven ground transport vessel be connected to this ship by air," Bailey frowned. An air tube? Yes, it is a common technique, frequently used in space, in order that personnel and material be transferred from one vessel to another without the necessity of special equipment against vacuum. It would seem then that you are not acquainted with the technique. "No," said Bailey, "but I get the picture." It is, of course, rather complicated to arrange such a device between spaceship and ground vehicle, but I have requested that it be done. Fortunately, the mission on which you and I are engaged is one of high priority. Difficulties are smoothed out quickly. Are you assigned to the murder case too? Have you not been informed of that? I regret not having told you at once. There was, of course, no sign of regret on the robot's perfect face. It was Dr. Han Fastolf, whom you met on Earth during our previous partnership, and whom I hope you remember, who first suggested you as an appropriate investigator in this case. He made it a condition that I be assigned to work with you once more. Bailey managed a smile. Dr. Fastolf was a native of Aurora, and Aurora was the strongest of the outer worlds. Apparently the advice of an Auroran bore weight. Bailey said, "A team that works shouldn't be broken up, eh?" The first exhilaration of Daniil's appearance was fading, and the compression about Bailey's chest was returning. I do not know if that precise thought was in his mind, partner Elijah. From the nature of his orders to me, I should think that he was interested in having assigned to work with you one who would have experience with your world and would know of your consequent peculiarities. Peculiarities? Bowie frowned and felt offended. It was not a term he liked in connection with himself. So that I could arrange the air tube, for example. I am well aware of your aversion to open spaces as a result of your upbringing in the cities of Earth. Perhaps it was the effect of being called peculiar, the feeling that he had to counterattack or lose caste to a machine, that drove Bailey to change the subject sharply. Perhaps it was just that lifelong training prevented him from leaving any logical contradiction undisturbed. He said, "There was a robot in charge of my welfare on board this ship. A robot," a touch of malice intruded itself here, "that looks like a robot. Do you know it? I spoke to it before coming on board. What's its designation? How do I make contact with it?" "It is RX-2475. It is customary on Solaria to use only serial numbers for robots." Daniil's calm eyes swept the control panel near the door. "This contact will signal it." Bailey looked at the control panel himself, and, since the contact to which Daniil pointed was labeled RX, its identification seemed quite unmysterious. Bailey put his finger over it, and in less than a minute, the robot, the one that looked like a robot, entered. Bailey said, "You are RX-2475. "Yes, sir. You told me earlier that someone would arrive to escort me off the ship. Did you mean him?" Bailey pointed at Daniil. The eyes of the two robots met. RX-2475 said, "His papers identify him as the one who was to meet you. Were you told in advance anything about him other than his papers? Was he described to you?" "No, sir. I was given his name, however." "Who gave you the information?" "The captain of the ship, sir." "Who is a Solarian?" "Yes, sir." Bailey licked his lips. The next question would be decisive. He said, "What were you told would be the name of the one you were expecting?" RX-2475 said, "Daniil Oliva, sir." "Good boy, you may leave now." There was the robotic bow and then the sharp about face. RX-2475 left. Bailey turned to his partner and said thoughtfully, "You are not telling me all the truth, Daniil." "In what way, partner Elijah?" asked Daniil. "While I was talking to you earlier, I recalled an odd point. RX-2475, when it told me I would have an escort, said a man would come for me. I remember that quite well." Daniil listened quietly and said nothing. Bailey went on. "I thought the robot might have made a mistake. I thought also that perhaps a man had indeed been assigned to meet me and had later been replaced by you, RX-2475, not being informed of the change. But you heard me check that. Your papers were described to it, and it was given your name. But it was not quite given your name at that, was it, Daniil? Indeed, it was not given my entire name, agreed Daniil. Your name is not Daniil Olival, but R. Daniil Olival, isn't it? Or in full, Robot Daniil Olival. You are quite correct, partner Elijah. From which it all follows that RX-2475 was never informed that you are a robot. It was allowed to think of you as a man. With your man-like appearance, such a masquerade is possible. I have no quarrel with your reasoning. Then let's proceed. Bailey was feeling the germs of a kind of savage delight. He was on the trace of something. It couldn't be anything much, but this was the kind of tracking he could do well. It was something he could do well enough to be called half across space to do. He said, "Now why should anyone want to deceive a miserable robot? It doesn't matter to it whether you are man or robot. It follows orders in either case. A reasonable conclusion, then, is that the Solarian captain who informed the robot and the Solarian officials who informed the captain did not themselves know you were a robot. As I say, that is one reasonable conclusion, but perhaps not the only one. Is this one true?" "I believe it is." "All right, then. Good guess. Now why?" "Dr. Han Fastolf, in recommending you as my partner, allows the Solarians to think you are a human. Isn't that a dangerous thing? The Solarians, if they find out, may be quite angry. Why was it done?" The humanoid robot said, "It was explained to me thus, partner Elijah. Your association with a human of the outer worlds would raise your status in the eyes of the Solarians. Your association with a robot would lower it. Since I was familiar with your ways and could work with you easily, it was thought reasonable to allow the Solarians to accept me as a man without actually deceiving them by a positive statement to that effect." Bailey did not believe it. It seemed like the kind of careful consideration for an Earthman's feelings that did not come naturally to a spacer, not even to as enlightened a one as Fastolf. He considered an alternative and said, "Are the Solarians well known among the outer worlds for the production of robots?" "I am glad," said Daniil, "that you have been briefed concerning the inner economy of Solaria." "Not a word," said Bailey. "I can guess the spelling of the word Solaria, and there my knowledge stops." "Then I do not see, partner Elijah, what it was that impelled you to ask that question, but it is a most pertinent one. You have hit the mark. My mind store of information includes the fact that, of the 50 outer worlds, Solaria is by far the best known for the variety and excellence of robot models it turns out. It exports specialized models to all the other outer worlds." Bailey nodded in grim satisfaction. Naturally, Daniil did not follow an intuitive mental leap that used human weakness as a starting point. Nor did Bailey feel impelled to explain the reasoning. If Solaria turned out to be a world expert in robotics, Dr. Han Fastolf and his associates might have purely personal and very human motives for demonstrating their own prize robot. It would have nothing at all to do with an Earthman's safety or feelings. They would be asserting their own superiority by allowing the expert Solarians to be fooled into accepting a robot of Auroran handiwork as a fellow man. Bailey felt much better. Strange that all the thought, all the intellectual powers he could muster, could not succeed in lifting him out of panic, and yet a sop to his own vainglory succeeded at once. The recognition of the vainglory of the spacers helped too. He thought Jehoshaphat were all human, even the spacers. Aloud he said, almost flippantly, "How long do we have to wait for the ground car? I'm ready." The air tube gave signs of not being well adapted to its present use. Man and humanoid stepped out of the spaceship erect, moving along flexible mesh that bent and swayed under their weight. In space, Bailey imagined hazily, men transferring weightlessly from ship to ship might easily skim along the length of the tube, impelled by an initial jump. Toward the other end, the tube narrowed clumsily, its meshing bunching as though some giant hand had constricted it. Daniil, carrying the flashlight, got down on all fours, and so did Bailey. They traveled the last 20 feet in that fashion, moving at last into what was obviously a ground car. Daniil closed the door through which they had entered, sliding it shut carefully. There was a heavy, clicking noise that might have been the detachment of the air tube. Bailey looked about curiously. There was nothing too exotic about the ground car. There were 2 seats in tandem, each of which could hold 3. There were doors at each end of each seat. The glossy sections that might ordinarily have been windows were black and opaque, as a result, undoubtedly, of appropriate polarization. Bailey was acquainted with that. The interior of the car was lit by 2 round spots of yellow illumination in the ceiling, and, in short, the only thing Bailey felt to be strange was the transmitter set into the partition immediately before the front seat, and, of course, the added fact that there were no visible controls. Bailey said, "I suppose the driver is on the other side of this partition." Daniil said, "Exactly so, partner Elijah, and we can give our orders in this fashion." He leaned forward slightly and flicked a toggle switch that set a spot of red light to flickering. He said quietly, "You may start now. We are ready." There was a muted whir that faded almost at once, a very slight, very transitory pressing against the back of the seat, and then nothing. Bailey said in surprise, "Are we moving?" Daniil said, "We are. The car does not move on wheels but glides along a diamagnetic force field. Except for acceleration and deceleration, you will feel nothing." "What about curves?" "The car will bank automatically to compensate. Its level is maintained when traveling up or downhill." "The controls must be complicated," said Bailey dryly. "Quite automatic. The driver of the vehicle is a robot." Bailey had about all he wanted on the ground car. He said, "How long will this take?" "About an hour. Air travel would have been speedier, but I was concerned to keep you enclosed, and the aircraft models available on Solaria do not lend themselves to complete enclosure, as does a ground car such as that in which we are now riding." Bailey felt annoyed at the other's concern. He felt like a baby in the charge of its nurse. He felt almost as annoyed, oddly enough, at Daniil's sentences. It seemed to him that such needlessly formal sentence structure might easily betray the robotic nature of the creature. For a moment, Bailey stared curiously at Daniil Olival. The robot, looking straight ahead, was motionless and unself-conscious under the other's gaze. Daniil's skin texture was perfect. The individual hairs on head and body had been lovingly and intricately manufactured and placed. The muscle movement under the skin was most realistic. No pains, however extravagant, had been spared. Yet Bailey knew, from personal knowledge, that limbs and chest could be split open along invisible seams so that repairs might be made. He knew there was metal and silicone under that realistic skin. He knew a positronic brain, most advanced but only positronic, nestled in the hollow of the skull. He knew that Daniil's thoughts were only short-lived positronic currents flowing along paths rigidly designed and foreordained by the manufacturer. But what were the signs that would give that away to the expert eye that had no foreknowledge? The trifling unnaturalness of Daniil's manner of speech, the unemotional gravity that rested so steadily upon him, the very perfection of his humanity? But he was wasting time. Bailey said, "Let's get on with it, Daniil. I suppose that before arriving here you were briefed on matters Solarian?" "I was, partner Elijah." "Good. That's more than they did for me. How large is the world?" "Its diameter is 9,500 miles. It is the outermost of 3 planets, and the only inhabited one. In climate and atmosphere it resembles Earth. Its percentage of fertile land is higher, its useful mineral content lower, but of course less exploited. The world is self-supporting and can, with the aid of its robot exports, maintain a high standard of living." Bailey said, "What's the population?" 20,000 people, partner Elijah." Bailey accepted that for a moment, then he said mildly, "You mean 20 million, don't you?" His scant knowledge of the outer worlds was enough to tell him that, although the worlds were underpopulated by earthly standards, the individual populations were in the millions. 20,000 people, partner Elijah," said the robot again. "You mean the planet has just been settled?" "Not at all. It has been independent for nearly 2 centuries, and it was settled for a century or more before that. The population is deliberately maintained at 20,000, that being considered optimum by the Solarians themselves. How much of the planet do they occupy? All the fertile portions, which is, in square miles, 30 million square miles, including marginal areas. For 20,000 people? There are also some 200 million working positronic robots, partner Elijah. Jehoshaphat, that's 10,000 robots per human. It is by far the highest such ratio among the outer worlds, partner Elijah. The next highest, on Aurora, is only 50-1. What can they use so many robots for? What do they want with all that food? Food is a relatively minor item. The mines are more important, and power production more important still. Bailey thought of all those robots and felt a trifle dizzy. 200 million robots, so many among so few humans. The robots must litter the landscape. An observer from without might think Solaria a world of robots altogether and fail to notice the thin human leaven. He felt a sudden need to see. He remembered the conversation with Minim and the sociologic prediction of Earth's danger. It seemed far off, a bit unreal, but he remembered. His personal dangers and difficulties since leaving Earth dimmed the memory of Minim's voice stating enormities with cool and precise enunciation, but never blotted it out altogether. Bailey had lived too long with duty to allow even the overwhelming fact of open space to stop him in its performance. Data collected from a spacer's words, or from those of a spacer robot for that matter, was the sort of thing that was already available to Earth's sociologists. What was needed was direct observation, and it was his job, however unpleasant, to collect it. He inspected the upper portion of the ground car. "Is this thing a convertible, Daniil?" "I beg your pardon, partner Elijah, but I do not follow your meaning." "Can the car's top be pushed back? Can it be made open to the sky?" He had almost said dome out of habit. "Yes, it can." "Then have that done, Daniil. I would like to take a look." The robot responded gravely, "I am sorry, but I cannot allow that." Bailey felt astonished. He said, "Look, R. Daniil." He stressed the R. "Let's rephrase that. I order you to lower the top." The creature was a robot, manlike or not. It had to follow orders. But Daniil did not move. He said, "I must explain that it is my first concern to spare you harm. It has been clear to me on the basis both of my instructions and of my own personal experience that you would suffer harm at finding yourself in large, empty spaces. I cannot, therefore, allow you to expose yourself to that." Bailey could feel his face darkening with an influx of blood, and at the same time could feel the complete uselessness of anger. The creature was a robot, and Bailey knew the first law of robotics well. It went, "A robot may not injure a human being, or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm." Everything else in a robot's positronic brain, that of any robot on any world in the galaxy, had to bow to that prime consideration. Of course, a robot had to follow orders, but with one major, all-important qualification. Following orders was only the second law of robotics. It went, "A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law." Bailey forced himself to speak quietly and reasonably. "I think I can endure it for a short time, Daniil." "That is not my feeling, partner Elijah." "Let me be the judge, Daniil." "If that is an order, partner Elijah, I cannot follow it." Bailey let himself lounge back against the softly upholstered seat. The robot would, of course, be quite beyond the reach of force. Daniil's strength, if exerted fully, would be 100 times that of flesh and blood. He would be perfectly capable of restraining Bailey without ever hurting him. Bailey was armed. He could point a blaster at Daniil, but, except for perhaps a momentary sensation of mastery, that action would only succeed in greater frustration. A threat of destruction was useless against a robot. Self-preservation was only the third law. It went, "A robot must protect its own existence, as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws." It would not trouble Daniil to be destroyed if the alternative were breaking the first law, and Bailey did not wish to destroy Daniil. Definitely not. Yet he did want to see out the car. It was becoming an obsession with him. He couldn't allow this nurse-infant relationship to build up. For a moment, he thought of pointing the blaster at his own temple. Open the car top, or I'll kill myself. Oppose one application of the first law by a greater and more immediate one. Bailey knew he couldn't do it. Too undignified. He disliked the picture conjured up by the thought. He said warily, "Would you ask the driver how close in miles we are to destination?" "Certainly, partner Elijah." Daniil bent forward and pushed the toggle switch, but as he did so, Bailey leaned forward too, crying out, "Driver, lower the top of the car!" And it was the human hand that moved quickly to the toggle switch and closed it again. The human hand held its place firmly thereafter. Panting a bit, Bailey stared at Daniil. For a second, Daniil was motionless, as though his positronic paths were momentarily out of stability in their effort to adjust to the new situation. But that passed quickly, and then the robot's hand was moving. Bailey had anticipated that. Daniil would remove the human hand from the switch, gently, not hurting it, reactivate the transmitter, and countermand the order. Bailey said, "You won't get my hand away without hurting me, I warn you. You will probably have to break my finger." That was not so. Bailey knew that. But Daniil's movement stopped, harm against harm. The positronic brain had to weigh probabilities and translate them into opposing potentials. It meant just a bit more hesitation. Bailey said, "It's too late." His race was won. The top was sliding back and pouring into the car, flow open, was the harsh white light of Solaria's sun. Bailey wanted to shut his eyes in initial terror, but fought the sensation. He faced the enormous wash of blue and green, incredible quantities of it. He could feel the undisciplined rush of air against his face, but could make out no details of anything. A moving something flashed past. It might have been a robot or an animal or an unliving something caught in a puff of air. He couldn't tell. The car went past it too quickly. Blue, green, air, noise, motion. And over it all, beating down, furiously, relentlessly, frighteningly, was the white light that came from a ball in the sky. For one fleeting split moment, he bent his head back and stared directly at Solaria's sun. He stared at it, unprotected by the diffusing glass of the city's uppermost level sun porches. He stared at the naked sun. And at the very moment, he felt Daniil's hands clamping down upon his shoulders. His mind crowded with thought during that unreal, whirling moment. He had to see. He had to see all he could. And Daniil must be there with him to keep him from seeing. But surely a robot would not dare use violence on a man. That thought was dominant. Daniil could not prevent him forcibly, and yet Bailey felt the robot's hands forcing him down. Bailey lifted his arms to force those fleshless hands away and lost all sensation. 3. A victim is named. Bailey was back in the safety of enclosure. Daniil's face wavered before his eyes, and it was splotched with dark spots that turned to red when he blinked. Bailey said, "What happened?" "I regret," said Daniil, "that you have suffered harm despite my presence. The direct rays of the sun are damaging to the human eye, but I believe that the damage from the short exposure you suffered will not be permanent. When you looked up, I was forced to pull you down and you lost consciousness." Bailey grimaced. That left the question open as to whether he had fainted out of overexcitement or fright, or had been knocked unconscious. He felt his jaw and head and found no pain. He forbore asking the question direct. In a way, he didn't want to know. He said, "It wasn't so bad. From your reactions, partner Elijah, I should judge you had found it unpleasant." "Not at all," said Bailey stubbornly. The splotches before his eyes were fading, and they weren't tearing so. "I'm only sorry I saw so little. We were moving too fast. Did we pass a robot?" "We passed a number of them. We are traveling across the Kinbald estate, which is given over to fruit orchards." "I'll have to try again," said Bailey. "You must not, in my presence," said Daniil. "Meanwhile, I have done as you requested." "As I requested?" "You will remember, partner Elijah, that before you ordered the driver to lower the top of the car, you had ordered me to ask the driver how close in miles we were to destination. We are 10 miles away now, and shall be there in some 6 minutes." Bailey felt the impulse to ask Daniil if he were angry at having been outwitted, if only to see that perfect face become imperfect, but he repressed it. Of course, Daniil would simply answer no, without rancor or annoyance. He would sit there as calm and as grave as ever, unperturbed and imperturbable. Bailey said quietly, "Just the same, Daniil, I'll have to get used to it, you know." The robot regarded his human partner. "To what is it that you refer?" "Jehoshaphat, to the outdoors. It's all this planet is made of." "There will be no necessity for facing the outdoors," said Daniil. Then, as though that disposed of the subject, he said, "We are slowing down, partner Elijah. I believe we have arrived. It will be necessary to wait now for the connection of another air tube leading to the dwelling that will serve as our base of operations." "An air tube is unnecessary, Daniil. If I am to be working outdoors, there is no point in delaying the indoctrination. There will be no reason for you to work outdoors, partner Elijah." The robot started to say more, but Bailey waved him quiet with a peremptory motion of the hand. At the moment, he was not in the mood for Daniil's careful consolations, for soothings, for assurances that all would be well and that he would be taken care of. What he really wanted was an inner knowledge that he could take care of himself and fulfill his assignment. The sight and feel of the open had been hard to take. It might be that when the time came, he would lack the hardihood to dare face it again, at the cost of his self-respect and, conceivably, of Earth's safety, all over a small matter of emptiness. His face grew grim even at the glancing touch of that thought. He would face air, sun, and empty space yet. Elijah Bailey felt like an inhabitant of one of the smaller cities, say Helsinki, visiting New York and counting the levels in awe. He had thought of a dwelling as something like an apartment unit, but this was nothing like it at all. He passed from room to room endlessly. Panoramic windows were shrouded closely, allowing no hint of disturbing day to enter. Lights came to life noiselessly from hidden sources as they stepped into a room and died again as quietly when they left. "So many rooms," said Bailey with wonder. "So many. It's like a very tiny city, Daniil." "It would seem so, partner Elijah," said Daniil with equanimity. It seemed strange to the Earthman. Why was it necessary to crowd so many spacers together with him in close quarters? He said, "How many will be living here with me?" Daniil said, "There will be myself, of course, and a number of robots." Bailey thought he ought to have said, "a number of other robots." Again, he found it obvious that Daniil had the intention of playing the man thoroughly, even for no other audience than Bailey, who knew the truth so well. And then that thought popped into nothing under the force of a second, more urgent one. He cried, "Robots, how many humans?" "None, partner Elijah." They had just stepped into a room, crowded from floor to ceiling with book films. 3 fixed viewers with large 24-inch viewing panels set vertically were in 3 corners of the room. The 4th contained an animation screen. Bailey looked about in annoyance. He said, "Did they kick everyone out just to leave me rattling around alone in this mausoleum?" "It is meant only for you. A dwelling such as this for one person is customary on Solaria." "Everyone lives like this?" "Everyone. What do they need all the rooms for?" "It is customary to devote a single room to a single purpose. This is the library. There is also a music room, a gymnasium, a kitchen, a bakery, a dining room, a machine shop, various robot repair and testing rooms, 2 bedrooms. "Stop! How do you know all this?" "It is part of the information pattern," said Daniil smoothly, "made available to me before I left Aurora." "Jehoshaphat, who takes care of all of this?" He swung his arm in a wide arc. "There are a number of household robots. They have been assigned to you and will see to it that you are comfortable." "But I don't need all this," said Bailey. He had the urge to sit down and refuse to budge. He wanted to see no more rooms. "We can remain in one room if you so desire, partner Elijah." That was visualized as a possibility from the start. Nevertheless, Solarian customs being what they are, it was considered wiser to allow this house to be built. "Built! Built!" Bailey stared. "You mean this was built for me? All this? Specially? A thoroughly roboticized economy. Yes, I see what you're going to say. What will they do with the house when all this is over? I believe they will tear it down. Bailey's lips clamped together. Of course. Tear it down. Build a tremendous structure for the special use of one Earthman, and then tear down everything he touched. Sterilize the soil the house stood on. Fumigate the air he breathed. The spacers might seem strong, but they, too, had their foolish fears. Daniil seemed to read his thoughts, or to interpret his expression, at any rate. He said, "It may appear to you, partner Elijah, that it is to escape contagion that they will destroy the house. If such are your thoughts, I suggest that you refrain from making yourself uncomfortable over the matter. The fear of disease on the part of spacers is by no means so extreme. It is just that the effort involved in building the house is, to them, very little. Nor does the waste involved in tearing it down once more seem great to them. And by law, partner Elijah, this place cannot be allowed to remain standing. It is on the estate of Hannes Gruer, and there can only be one legal dwelling place on any estate, that of the owner. This house was built by special dispensation for a specific purpose. It is meant to house us for a specific length of time, till our mission is completed." "And who is Hannes Gruer?" asked Bailey. "The head of Solarian security. We are to see him on arrival." "Are we? Jehoshaphat, Daniil, when do I begin to learn anything at all about anything? I'm working in a vacuum and I don't like it. I might as well go back to Earth. I might as well." He felt himself working up into resentment and cut himself short. Daniil never wavered. He merely waited his chance to speak. He said, "I regret the fact that you are annoyed. My general knowledge of Solaria does seem to be greater than yours. My knowledge of the murder case itself is as limited as is your own. It is Agent Gruer who will tell us what we must know. The Solarian government has arranged this." "Well then, let's get to this, Gruer. How long a trip will it be?" Bailey winced at the thought of more travel, and the familiar constriction in his chest was making itself felt again. Daniil said, "No travel is necessary, partner Elijah. Agent Gruer will be waiting for us in the conversation room." "A room for conversation too?" Bailey murmured wryly. Then, in a louder voice, "Waiting for us now?" "I believe so." "Then let's get to him, Daniil." Hannes Gruer was bald, and that without qualification. There was not even a fringe of hair at the sides of his skull. It was completely naked. Bailey swallowed and tried, out of politeness, to keep his eyes off that skull, but couldn't. On Earth there was the continuous acceptance of spacers at the spacers' own evaluation. The spacers were the unquestioned lords of the galaxy. They were tall, bronze of skin and hair, handsome, large, cool, aristocratic. In short, they were all R. Daniil Olival was, but with the fact of humanity in addition. And the spacers who were sent to Earth often did look like that, perhaps were deliberately chosen for that reason. But here was a spacer who might have been an Earthman for all his appearance. He was bald, and his nose was misshapen too. Not much, to be sure, but on a spacer even a slight asymmetry was noteworthy. Bailey said, "Good afternoon, sir. I am sorry if we kept you waiting." No harm in politeness. He would have to work with these people. He had the momentary urge to step across the expanse of room, how ridiculously large, and offer his hand in greeting. It was an urge easy to fight off. A spacer certainly would not welcome such a greeting. A hand covered with earthly germs. Gruer sat gravely, as far away from Bailey as he could get, his hands resting within long sleeves, and probably there were filters in his nostrils, although Bailey couldn't see them. It even seemed to him that Gruer cast a disapproving look at Daniil, as though to say, "You're a queer spacer, standing that close to an Earthman." That would mean Gruer simply did not know the truth. Then Bailey noticed suddenly that Daniil was standing at some distance, at that, farther than he usually did. Of course, too close, and Gruer might find the proximity unbelievable. Daniil was intent on being accepted as human. Gruer spoke in a pleasant, friendly voice, but his eyes tended to remain furtively on Daniil, looking away then drifting back. He said, "I haven't been waiting long. Welcome to Solaria, gentlemen. Are you comfortable?" "Yes, sir, quite," said Bailey. He wondered if etiquette would require that Daniil as the spacer should speak for the two, but rejected that possibility resentfully. Jehoshaphat, it was he himself who had been requested for the investigation, and Daniel had been added afterward. Under the circumstances, Bailey...
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.